And welcome back, rugby fans, to Rugby 411. I am your host. My name is Joshua Shibata. And yes, we are talking playoffs again. Playoffs? Playoffs? Yes, we are talking playoffs once again because after week number 17, the playoff picture for the MLR 2022 season is not quite locked in just yet. All six spots of the playoffs, three in the Eastern Conference, three in the West, have been claimed by their respective teams, but the order of those teams have not quite been solidified just yet. And because I love playoff scenarios, I love discussing them, figuring them out, and my prior playoff video had a very good review. So I decided we'll do it again because we are going into the final week of week 18. So we only need to do this one more time with the playoff scenarios, but there is still a lot to play for. It's not as confusing as the prior week, but still it's good to figure out exactly what needs to happen for all the teams in the playoffs. So what I like to do is let's figure out first the Eastern Conference. So we're pulling up the header here. Now, first of all, the New England Free Jacks, with their win over NOLA, secured the number one overall seed in the playoffs with a 13-2 record, 61 points. So, regardless of what happens in week number 18, when they play against Rugby New York, which is going to be a very important game for Rugby New York, but for New England has no bearing on their ranking or position at all. They have the number one overall ranking, which means that as long as New England makes the championship game, they will be hosting every game they play. So they'll host the Eastern Conference Championship, playing whoever is, whether it's going to be Rugby ATL or Rugby New York. And then they will, if they win that game, they will be hosting the MLR Championship as well. Because in MLR, the team with the overall best record hosts the MLR Championship game. There is no neutral field venue for the MLR Championship game yet. So that's why having the overall record is so important. So, New England's spot is secure. Like I mentioned before, nothing that happens in week number 18 affects them at all. But they are playing against Rugby New York. Now, granted, that is at New England, so it will be kind of interesting to see how this game turns out. But Rugby New York, we're going to skip ATL just for the moment here. But Rugby New York, technically sitting at third. And even though ATL and New York have the same points, they're both 10-5, 52 points. It's the point differential that's important here. When a tie occurs, what goes on after who has the most points and who has the most individual wins is the point differential, meaning how many more points did you score compared to how many points you had other teams score against you. And as you can see, Rugby ATL way ahead of Rugby New York. Rugby ATL is at a plus 102, while Rugby New York is only at a measly plus 18. So, meaning, if Rugby New York beats New England, and if Rugby ATL, who's hosting NOLA, who just got spanked by New England, if ATL beats NOLA, and they win, and they both score the same amount of points, so meaning a win in rugby and Major League Rugby, you get 4 points. If you score 4 tries in that win, you get an extra bonus point. So there's a possibility of winning 5 points total. So if Rugby ATL gets 5 points and New York gets 5 points, and they're both tied at the end, then it goes to the point differential. And, unless New York scores at least 100-some points, and again, ATL only wins by 1. New York really doesn't have much of a chance of jumping ATL in a tied scenario. So New York is praying that ATL loses. Now, with that being said, it's going to be interesting to see, again, because New England has the number one overall spot secured, are they going to start their starters? It's been a brutal season. already some of their major stars like Bodie Waka has been dealing with some injuries. He did miss a couple of games, and coincidentally enough, that was a time when New England ended up losing. So it would kind of behoove New England to maybe rest their stars. Now, granted, they do get a bye the following week because the first place team in each conference gets the bye while the number 2 and the number 3 seeds play off against each other. So they do have a bye, but again, would they want to risk? And again, New York is a very tough team too. Do they want to risk having injuries to any of their starters? So will they really take this game seriously? That kind of plays in the favor of New York. Now again, let's move over to Atlanta. Atlanta is hosting NOLA. NOLA again just got spanked by New England 57-5. So one would assume that Atlanta has the advantage in this game against NOLA. So, all the pressure's on New York. New York has to assume that Atlanta might win with 5 points. New York has to win to at least make it competitive. And the detriment of it is that both games, NOLA and Atlanta and Rooney and New England, are playing at the same exact time. I believe the game is on Friday, which that's another thing. It's a rare 3 games are going to be on Friday night this week. So if you're playing our pick'em pool, you better make sure you get your picks in before Friday because there's 3 games that day. And NOLA ATL and Rooney and New England, for whatever reason, are being played at the same exact time. So kind of sucks for rugby fans. They'll have to be switching between streaming services at the Rugby Network to watch both games. But really, Rooney is not going to know the results of the game, or at least don't have any forethought, or Atlanta either, of whether or not the other team is going to win or lose. They just have to play, and they just have to win. So, again, the scenario is right now in the favor of Atlanta. If they win, Atlanta is going to host New York. If New York wins and Atlanta loses, then New York is going to host Atlanta. And again, home field advantage is a very important thing in Major League Rugby, so you want to get that precious second seed. So ATL, New York have a lot to play for in the game. New England, not so much. So, and that is the Eastern Conference with their scenario. Now, let's move over to the Western Conference. In the West, again, all the positions have been claimed, so the 3 playoff spots have been claimed, but again, the number 1, number 2 spot in this case have not been solidified just yet. Houston, with their odd way of getting into the playoffs, they lost to Seattle, but they were able to secure 2 bonus points. And again, in Major League Rugby, if you don't know, if you lose within 7 points of your opponent, you get a bonus point. And just like with the win bonus point I mentioned before, even if you lose, if you can score 4 tries in that loss, you still get another bonus point. So a losing team has the ability to still walk away with 2 points, which, as we saw with Houston, was enough to get them into the playoffs. But sitting at 9-6 with 48 points, there is no way in any scenario that they can move from that number 3 spot, because if we jump up to Austin is at 11-4 with 53 points. Even if Austin loses, Houston can only get 10 wins, and the tiebreaker in the end, if Houston scores 5 points, they will tie with Austin, but they will only have 10 wins compared to Austin's 11. So that's not going to be enough for them to jump them. If we had to go with point differential too, if you look at Austin's point differential, 231. They have been the most dominant team and the best defense as well in Major League Rugby. There is no way Houston would have been able to catch up with them with only being up as a plus 30. So Houston is stuck at the number 3 spot, even if Austin loses, even if LA loses, they are stuck at number 3. So that makes what's coming up in week number 18 very, very interesting, because in week number 18, Austin and Houston are playing against each other at Houston. So the scenario here is that regardless if Houston wins or not in this game, Houston are still going to have to travel. They cannot get that number 2 spot, so they're going to go to play against whoever is the number 2 spot. Okay, now this is where we move into the number 1 and number 2 spot scenario. So LA is sitting right now at number 1, 11-4 with 54 points. They are just ahead of Austin by 1 point. Austin is 11-4 with 53 points. Now, if LA wins, but only wins by 4 points, Austin still has the ability to tie with them by winning with 5 points. Like I said again, you can win 5 points if you score 4 tries in the win. If LA doesn't score 4 tries in their win over Seattle, they'll only get 4, and technically LA and Austin will be tied. But as I mentioned before, Austin's point differential is 231. They are way above LA. So unless LA wins by a lot of points, that tiebreaker goes in favor of Austin, so Austin could jump LA. Now, obviously, if LA loses and Austin wins, Austin still jumps over LA. If LA wins and Austin loses, LA stays in the number 1 spot. If both teams lose and they don't get any bonus points, then LA will still win. If LA loses and Austin loses, but Austin's somehow able to get at least a bonus point, there's a possibility they can still jump LA. So there are a lot of little scenarios with those two teams. But ultimately, in the end, what's going to be interesting is Austin plays against Houston. At Houston. Houston, win, lose, whatever, is not going to change their situation. They are still going to be the number 3 team. Do they field their starters as well? Or do they let their starters sit, knowing that they'll have a tougher game technically, either playing at Austin in a rematch or playing at LA? That makes it very interesting to see what the gamesmanship in Houston's mentality is. Now, Austin obviously wants to win the game because they have a possibility of still making that number 1 seed if LA somehow loses or if they somehow tie at the end between LA and Houston. Between LA and Austin. So Austin has all to play for. Houston, not so much. So I'm curious to see if Houston kind of decides not to. But then again, too, they are going to kind of squander the fact that they're playing at home in front of their fans for the last time in the season. They'll probably want their fans to go home happy, And again, it's a Houston-Austin rivalry in Texas. Right now, Austin is up in that rivalry. Houston, again, has a lot to play for. So, again, it wouldn't be surprising to see Houston field their starters in this game. Again, a win for them doesn't change the scenario. They may have to play Austin again, but at Austin. But a win kind of might give them a little bit of a mental edge, knowing that they beat Austin and then go into Austin to beat them again. Now, granted, if you play the math and the numbers, the statistics of beating a team 2 times in a row is very, very hard. Now, granted, a few teams have done that in pro football. Not too many teams have done it in Major League Rugby. So, again, it's going to be interesting to see what Houston does in this game. And then, of course, LA goes against Seattle as the last game of the season. So, if Austin somehow loses, I don't want to say somehow. There is any possibility that Austin loses. But if Austin does lose to Houston, LA may not play their starters because they will have that number 1 seed secured. But if Austin does win, then LA definitely has to play Seattle. And granted, Seattle hasn't been very consistent all season, but Seattle played really, really well and beat Houston last week. Now, granted, that was in Seattle. This game is going to be at the world-famous Coliseum, where Seattle does not have that home field advantage or that 16th man at Starfire Stadium, so completely different scenario. Plays in the favor of LA, but again, Seattle could play spoiler and end up beating LA, which could possibly allow Austin to jump. So a lot more scenarios to play out for in the Western Conference. Again, LA and Austin are still fighting for that number 1 spot. Houston is in the playoffs regardless. They'll either be played at LA or they'll be played at Austin in the first round of the Western Conference playoffs. So those are the scenarios. Hopefully, again, that this video made sense for you guys. A lot to play for. Not, unlike in week 17 where you had a lot more games that had an effect or a factor in. With the week number 18, it's really only those 4 games. You have Nola and Atlanta, Rooney and New England in the East, and you have Austin and Houston, Seattle and LA in the West. But those 4 games are going to be the games that I feel everyone's going to be watching in week number 18. And again, it will then solidify and show us who's going off into the playoffs for the 2022 season. It's sad that the season is ending, but it just makes us more excited that the playoffs are going to start right after. So once again, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoy week number 18 and seeing who ends up where in the playoffs. And as always, I'll see you on the pitch.